course, Victoria Campbell. Oh.
Good afternoon.
Now, I personally would like to know a little bit more about you. I'm sure the people watching would as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name is Victoria Campbell, and I write for teenagers and young adults. So far, I've mainly written about the Vikings, which is very apt in York. My first book is called Viking Gold, and my second book is coming out in October in time for Christmas, and it's called Viking Siege. And both of them are historical action adventures, kind of classic quest narratives. And I certainly find them exciting to write, so I hope that people find them exciting to read as well.
Has writing always been a career choice for you since a young age?
Well, when I was at school, I did love reading. I think what I loved about reading was the fact that you could choose a book of your own choice and often do or be anything that you wanted to be through the conduit of reading. But when I was at school, I didn't actually ever get the chance to meet anybody who had written a book, so I didn't really know how you went about becoming a writer. And it wasn't until about maybe 10 or 15 years after I finished school that I first met a real live author, as it were. And I have to say, when I was at school, I decided to be perhaps a little bit more practical. And I went to university in Glasgow, and I qualified as a lawyer, as a Scots lawyer, and I practiced as a solicitor in Glasgow for about 10 years. And I enjoyed that, but at the back of my mind, I still had a real niggle that I quite fancied becoming a writer. And at this point, my husband actually started to do a little bit of writing. And when I discovered this, I kind of got a bit annoyed. And I thought, that's an ambition that I've had for years. So if he can start doing that, then so can I. So I promised myself I would start writing, and I did. And I just got really involved in the sort of local writing community in and around Glasgow. There's loads of events there for writers to go to. I'm sure it's the same in York and in most other cities in the UK. There was loads of support, loads of courses you could do at the local colleges and universities. There was writing groups, there was networking events. I just went along to everything that I could, basically, that I had time to go to when I was still working full-time as a lawyer. And I was writing for about maybe 7 or 8 years before I took the plunge and started writing full-time.
So your debut book, Viking Gold, published in 2011. Can you tell us a bit about the book?
Yes, indeed. 2011, I guess it does seem like quite a while ago now. The next one really should be out already, but they take some time to sort of gestate, as it were. Well, Viking Gold, it's set in Viking times, so it's set 1,000 years ago, actually kind of towards the end of the Viking Age, which kind of appealed to me because it means there's a lot of new and conflicting ideas around at the time. I quite like playing with characters who represent different ways of thinking. And our hero, who's 16, he's called Redney, and he is a Viking. And when the story begins, things are a bit grim for him, actually, in his village, because his father died a coward. So nobody in his village really wants to have anything to do with the son of the coward. It's a very martial society. And the only person who will speak to him is Sinead, our heroine. She's also 16, but she's Irish, so she isn't a Viking. And she's been brought to live in this Viking village as a slave. Something which I have to say, she is actually pretty annoyed about. And she also kind of represents a different way of thinking because she's within the sort of cartilage, as it were, of Christian Europe, which is something the Vikings aren't at this point, not quite yet at this point in time. And so she's been exposed to things that perhaps some of the Vikings haven't. So for instance, she can read, and she's seen books before. This idea of an actual book is not something that the Vikings would necessarily have been familiar with, certainly not books written in Latin, though the Vikings would have had their own runes at this early point. But she kind of represents this sort of modernity or the new way of doing things, a new way of thinking. And Redney and Sinead, they discover an old book. And this book talks about a great land far to the west filled with treasure, and that is really the catalyst for them to go on their quest and to find this land, which may or may not be modern day America, but I couldn't say.
Right, so you said in October the next book in the series is going to be Viking Siege. Can you give us any sort of peeks about what is in the book?
Yes, definitely. So Viking Siege involves some of the same characters. It certainly involves Rennie and Sinead. But whereas the first book in the series is set in Norway and across the North Atlantic on their way to what may be America, the second book is set in Normandy, in northwestern France. And I was quite intrigued to discover that the word Normandy actually means Northman, or is a derivative thereof. And so Normandy is actually a Viking settlement, kind of pushing the Frankish people out of that area. And Normandy is also one of the first places, certainly France anyway, and also Normandy, they're one of the first places to have what we would recognise as castles. So I thought this is quite interesting, and this is another kind of changing point in time when people start to build these castles. And so it's all about the siege of an early castle, and our hero, Rennie, he's having to defend this castle. And it gets a bit complicated about who's on whose side, but Sinead, our heroine, she's been promised, she said she will marry the owner of this castle, but in fact our hero has discovered that he's a bit of a nasty piece of work and would really prefer it that Sinead weren't to marry him and perhaps, would notice him instead. So it's a kind of, whereas the first one is a quest, this one is much more settled in one place. It's about siege warfare, it's got a bit of murder mystery as well. The first one has a bit of murder mystery too, and it's got just a little bit of romance as well.
Right, so this may be looking a bit too far into the future, but are there any plans for any other books after Viking Siege?
Yes, absolutely. I've got a few things, a few projects in the back of my mind that I want to get started on. I've already got started doing a little bit of research and forward planning, very, very general forward planning for a book set during the Second World War. Indeed, it also seems like quite a popular time period, whereas with the Vikings, there's really very little information about them. You're always scrabbling around trying to find enough information to build a story. With World War II, there's loads of information, which has its positive points. It means if you want to write about a particular aspect of the Second World War, there's loads of information, but it means it's easy to trip up because the information is bound to be out there if you decide just to make a bit up. So World War II is a project that I'll be working on next. And a problem, I think, I don't know if it's a problem exactly, but certainly something that I've noticed is for English language books about World War II, if they're set with British characters, then the problem is that it's all home front stuff. There's no real front of line action. However, I was in Jersey a couple of years ago, and Jersey the Channel Islands were occupied. So I think we will set it in the Channel Islands, so there will actually be frontline action with English language speakers, which makes it easier than having to do a lot of research in French or such like. So that's what I'm going to be doing next.
Right, so are you going to return to the Viking era?
Yes. Yes, I plan that after that. It's probably, this is quite far into the future now, it's probably to have a look at Viking Age Russia. It's something that I don't think has been done. I mean, I stand corrected if it has, but I don't think there's very much out there, certainly not in English, about Viking Age Russia, and I think it could be quite fascinating. So I think that's what I'll start to look at, but that's probably at least 18 months to 2 years down the line.
So what are the sort of processes that you would have to go to start thinking about writing a book and actually up until the point of it being published?
Gosh, okay, well I suppose for everyone it's a little bit different, but for me, basically I'll get an idea of some sort, and I tend to not have ideas in complete isolation. I'll tend to see or hear about something or read a book or see a newspaper report or something that will get me thinking, that's a slightly different angle on what has been done endlessly before, and I'm interested in that particular angle. Like as in with Jersey and World War II, or with Russia and the Vikings and such like. And then what I'll do is I'll read a bit about the subject, read history books or other non-fiction books to get a bit of an understanding about it, and just kind of mull it over in my mind for a while. And then I will actually start to write it, think about who my main character is, what would their problem be, what is the problem that they have to solve, that sort of thing. And I tend to write a first draft straight onto my laptop, but I will make loads and loads of notes. Sometimes in notebooks, I tend to lose notebooks. So what I've started to do is I've started to make notes on A4 paper and then slide those sheets of paper, the notes in between the actual printed out parts of the story, so as if I'm writing a scene about mangonels, my notes on mangonels are actually physically beside that scene, and I find that works better for me rather than having loads and loads of notebooks half written in, distributed around the house and the boot of my car and such like. And I kind of build it up iteratively. I mean, I'll read a bit more about a section that I need to know a bit more about, and I'll write that scene, and then I'll kind of read a bit more generally, and then I'll kind of push it forward. So I do my research and my writing kind of in tandem, although I will have done quite a bit of research up front. So that's kind of how I do it. And then I will redraft, anything up to 30 or 40 times I'll redraft. Perhaps even more. I'm kind of obsessed about language in the sense that I think it should be as clear and as easy to understand as possible, and that it shouldn't hinder telling a good story. If somebody has to read a sentence twice to understand it, then in my opinion that's not necessarily the place for it in a novel, in a fiction book. It might be the place for it in a non-fiction book, but for me the story should do the work and the language should do the lifting for the story.
Right, so you obviously have quite a lot of ideas sort of floating around in your head. Are there any particular authors or books that have influenced you in sort of writing?
You know, to a certain extent everything I've ever read to a certain extent, and I tend to have quite wide reading tastes, and since I have started writing professionally, I've made it a policy, as it were. I've made the effort to try and read in as many different genres of books as possible. So whereas perhaps naturally I'm inclined to read historical fiction or murder mystery or thriller or even a little bit of romance, I try to force myself to read books I might not otherwise read to see what they are doing right. So I try to read really widely, and I try to read authors that I think, or I've been told, to do something well in their own genre. But in terms of specific influences, and in terms of things that might appeal to people within the same readership bracket as my books, certainly I enjoyed reading a book called The 39 Steps by John Buchan, and that's a sort of first spy thriller. It's kind of precursor to James Bond. It's set, I think, if I remember rightly, just before the First World War. I think that's right. And actually, it was before the Second World War. I think it's set just before the First World War, and it's really the first modern spy thriller. And it's a chase scene. The majority of the book is a chase across the Scottish moors. And although I'm writing about Vikings, you might think that's quite far removed from that, but no, I liked how he conveyed tension and speed, and how the whole thing was quite tight and fast moving and kept going forward. So I liked that about that book. And another book that I read when I was about maybe 13 or 14 was called The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy, and that's actually a whole series of books, and there's loads of movies based around this book. So if people haven't read the book, quite often they'll have seen at least one of the movies or the TV programmes. And what I liked about that is it's set during the French Revolution, and it's about an English aristocrat who rescues French aristocrats from the guillotine. And it's exciting, and it's the characters are all very debonair, there's a bit of romance, there's lots of peril, there's lots of secrets. Each character has a secret, and although I'm writing again about Vikings and it's not the French Revolution, I love characters that have secrets and ulterior motives, and I love characters that have difficult questions to answer. And the main female character in that book, she has done something in the past that she's not pleased about, she's not proud of, and she has a real moral quandary. And I love it when characters have a quandary that's not immediately obvious from the start of the book. That's a real swashbuckling adventure that would appeal to both boys and girls, I think.
Right, so finally, what tips would you give to people who are thinking about starting to write books or trying to get books published?
Okay, well, I think there's a few stages to this, definitely. I would say keep reading, read loads, read intelligently as well. So, I mean, read for enjoyment, but then think after you finish the book, what did that author do well? What did they not do so well? What would you do differently? You know, actually analyse what you've read. I'm not saying sit down and write an essay about it, but just ponder for a few minutes. Did you like it? Why did you like it? You know, so read intelligently, read with discernment, as it were. But read lots of different kinds of books. Challenge yourself to read books that you might not always read, which is what I've been trying to do over the last few years. I would also suggest writing loads. I know that some of the students here are taking part in the Radio 2 writing competition, so I think that's a great thing to do. just get writing. I think that you learn through doing a lot of the time, and also there's a lot of really good books out there giving advice on writing. Sometimes their advice has to be taken with a pinch of salt, but sometimes it's really good. I would certainly recommend a book called On Writing by Stephen King, the horror writer, the American horror writer. His book is very easy to digest and it's semi-autobiographical, so you get to know a bit more about him. I would also suggest, when it's appropriate, to go along to any courses or activities that are put on for young people in relation to writing. If your school has something you can write for, to write for that. If you don't have a creative writing club, ask to set one up. If local colleges or universities are doing summer courses or holiday courses for young people, get involved with those. There's loads of information online. The BBC certainly has loads of information for aspiring radio writers or screenwriters, and I'm pretty sure that the museums in York do creative writing courses over the holidays as well. I'm pretty sure that the York Viking Museum does, you see. So look out for all the opportunities that are. Get completely absorbed in the culture of writing, and so you know all about it, what's happening. Subscribe to any magazines on creative writing, there's quite a few, and but most of all, keep writing and take opportunities to actually edit your work and get it published in your school magazines, school newspapers, competitions, etc.
Right, well thank you Victoria Campbell for being with us today, and I've been Dominic Bilby and this has been BBC Schools Report at Bootham.